Let's move on because a crucial parliamentary election is taking place in Iraq today. The votes will determine whether the Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani can maintain power. Looming over voters are fears of another war between Israel and Iran and potential Israeli or even US strikes on Iran-backed groups in Iraq. Well, these polls are taking place against the backdrop of a boycott called by the populist Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, which is expected to cause a low turnout. We're going to talk more on this and bring in Renad Mansour. He's a senior research fellow at Chatham House and the director of Iraq Initiative. Renad, thank you so much for joining us on the programme. First of all, I want to get your take on how good of a chance you see Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani having of maintaining power here.
Well, I think there's two things there. The first question is how likely is the prime minister to win the election, or at least be the front runner? And I think most of the polling has suggested that his coalition is ahead in the polls. But then there's the second question, which is the more important question, which is, will the prime minister hang on to power? It's important to note that since regime change in Iraq over the last 20 years, the leader who has won the election has never gone on to become the prime minister, in a way. So, and the reason for that is because the government formation process takes hundreds of days, and it involves intense negotiation between different political parties. And the prime minister's coalition itself is quite fragile. It's not a single party. It's many different groups, many different leaders taking advantage of the kind of incumbency wave. And so for that reason, the prime minister's list may come first, but there are many parties competing, and any government will have to be a coalition government, and the candidate that becomes prime minister will have to be a consensus compromise. And this really means that the chances for Mohammed Shia Sudani to remain in a second term are quite slim.
Well, Rana, let's talk about the mood among Iraqis. We've heard so much about how disillusioned they are during these elections. What's driving that disillusionment?
It's partly what I mentioned. Iraqis, were told after 2003 that they now live in a democracy, and elections were seen to be an important pulse of that democracy. You can vote, and if you don't like your leadership, you can vote every 4 years. But sadly, what Iraqis have learned is elections haven't really brought about change. In fact, it's been the same leaders recycling their seats and negotiating amongst each other, taking the seats as bargaining chips. So they haven't seen much change. And more critically, Iraq is a very wealthy country. Its budget every year is over $100 billion. And yet there isn't 24-hour electricity. In many parts of Iraq, there isn't good, clean water. Many are unemployed, and youth unemployment is on the rise. This basic standard of living in Iraq for many Iraqis is subpar, and many are suffering. So they put two and two together. They say, our country is very wealthy, but we don't really feel any of that wealth. And when we try and vote, and we've tried to vote in the past, the people who we voted for haven't really turned out to make the government or become the leader. So there is a strong resistance to what they call the political parties. That is the elites that are now governing the system on top, who are not interested in genuine sort of democratic change and accountability.
Let's look closely at the Prime Minister's track record so far, because he's had to walk a bit of a tightrope, hasn't he, between the US and Tehran's influence.
Yes, that's right. And one of, I think, the more remarkable stories is in a Middle East that's been in perpetual conflict for the last few years, since October 7th. Iraq has for once been insulated. Iraq has not been the center of Middle East conflict, which kind of became the norm for a long time, but it's been one of the more stable countries. Even though it's been in the orbit of Iran for many years, it's been one of the only countries, it's the only country that has an axis of resistance, that has this kind of Iranian relationship, that hasn't felt the violence and conflicts like countries like Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Yemen, and Iran even. So the prime prime minister has managed, and the government in Baghdad has managed to keep their heads down, to focus on economic investment and infrastructure, to take advantage of an oil price that has been relatively stable, to just build and stay away from resistance. Many of the sort of armed groups and militias that people assumed would immediately come to Iran's defense or to fight for Iran have actually stayed quiet. And there's been a kind of restraint. And for these reasons, Iraq thus far has managed to stay out of the regional conflict.
Well, just going back to this parliamentary election, the prominent Shia nationalist cleric Muqtada al-Sadr is boycotting this vote. How is that likely to impact the election?
And, we go back to the discussion of elections. It was actually, Muqtada Sadr's list won the last election, but were unable to form the government and then pulled out of parliament. And the lesson he's drawn from that is don't compete in elections. So certainly, he is one of the most prominent Iraqi political figures, and has a massive movement. So all around, Sadr city and other parts of southern Iraq and Baghdad, you have big populations who are loyal to the Shia cleric, the populist cleric, and who aren't voting. So it's likely that the voter turnout would be lower. From his perspective, he's trying to delegitimize the elections. He's trying to present himself as being against the political system, as being almost a protest leader in a way, while also trying to keep one foot in. So it's a balancing act for Muqtada Sadr, but certainly he is a powerful Iraqi social leader with a massive movement behind him.
Well, another key and big looming question over this election over Iraq is whether it's ready to manage its own security without the help of the US. The remaining US troops in Iraq are set to leave next year. Al-Sudani says Iraq is prepared to take on the challenge. Do you think that is the case?
The U.S. troop, Operation Inherent Resolve, that is coming to an end. Its goal was to combat ISIS, Daesh, and every year ISIS attacks have gone down, and they've been at historic lows. So to some extent, the security situation across Iraq is very stable. It's more stable than it's been for many years. So for this reason, the Prime Minister and the government have said we want a different relationship with the U.S. We don't want there to be a troop presence. We want to have bilateral relationships. We want to have what they call normalized relationships. So that is the case. I would say, however, Iraq has a lot of challenges, everything from climate change to corruption to this sort of dissatisfaction across the country. And some of the roots of conflict aren't really being addressed yet. So yes, while on the surface, Iraq is as stable as it's ever been, it remains quite fragile for a number of reasons.
Renad, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Really great to get your analysis on this. Thank you.